Today we're taking down the Ruy Lopez. I'll show you how to punish this classic opening and turn your opponent's favorite weapon into a quick disaster. If you are playing this position as black at all, you need to be ready to face the move bishop to b5, because it is nearly as popular as the move bishop to c4. Both moves are very common. So what to do when white goes bishop to b5? At first, you play pawn to a6, pushing the bishop one step back. Then what I recommend is the move pawn to d6. It is a very deceptive variation, actually, because at first it looks like you are playing these old-style Steinitz defense ideas. But in fact, you have something completely different in mind. After castles, which is the most popular move here, instead of just playing bishop to d7 and staying passive, we are going to be a lot more aggressive with bishop to g4. First of all, this puts a pin on the knight, and secondly, spoiler alert, in many of these variations, we are actually going to castle queenside and develop a crushing attack on the kingside. This is going to be a complete nightmare for white, because that is not what they were hoping for when they chose the Ruy Lopez opening. They expected a maneuvering game with a slight advantage, but instead we are flipping it into a massive attack against white. Okay, after bishop to g4, your opponent will often play pawn to h3, trying to kick away your bishop, but you continue with pawn to h5, setting a nice little trap along the way. And the beauty is, we do not really rely only on this trap, but if white plays pawn takes g4, it will actually be a losing mistake. Many opponents will fall right into it, but even if white does not fall into the trap immediately, it does not matter. That is part of your plan anyway. To quickly overview this line, if white captures, the h-file becomes wide open, and checkmate comes very quickly. For example, if white plays something like knight to h2 or knight to e1, it makes little difference. You simply bring your queen into the attack, and suddenly all of your pieces are lined up against white's king. At that point, the game is essentially over. It is also important to note that if white tries pushing a pawn forward to give their king an escape square, you can immediately shut that idea down with pawn to g3. That locks the king in place, and checkmate will follow shortly. So coming back to the main position, we know that pawn takes g4 is a losing blunder for white. The question then is, what can they do instead? In practice, most opponents simply get annoyed by this pin and try to deal with it another way. Because in most cases, white has no idea how to deal with this setup or how to get rid of it, they will usually play the standard move pawn to c3, as they so often do in the Ruy Lopez. Then you continue with queen to f6, which is a really powerful and flexible move. First, you are putting pressure on the knight, so if you want, you can trade there and break up white's pawn structure. That alone is quite nice. Second, this move also opens the path for your king to castle queenside. It does not mean you must do it immediately, but you have this option whenever you feel ready. And finally, from f6, your queen is also controlling the d4 square. That prevents white from pushing pawn to d4, which is one of their main ideas to gain activity. If they try it anyway, your queen is already lined up to trade and win that pawn. For that reason, most opponents will instead play pawn to d3, a more modest move just trying to finish development. At this point, your general plan is simple. Castle queenside, push your pawns aggressively on the kingside, and build a crushing attack against white's king. That, in a nutshell, is the idea. And yes, if the moment is right, you can even play pawn to g5 right away to launch the attack faster. White may be ready to capture your pawn, so pushing immediately is not an option. You also do not want to castle too early, because white could trade on c6 and damage your pawn shield, which might give them attacking chances. So instead, you play knight to a7. This supports your other knight, so you no longer need to worry about white capturing it. It is also a useful waiting move. White, annoyed by the pin, will almost always play knight to d2 to defend. But the beauty here is that this move actually blocks white's bishop on c1, cutting off its control of the diagonal. That gives you the freedom to play pawn to g5 safely, since white cannot capture the pawn anymore. From here, your kingside pawn storm begins. White does not have much to stop it, so they will usually make a standard developing move such as rook to e1. At that point, you continue with bishop to d7, another elegant move. This not only releases the pin, but also clears the path for your pawns to march forward and attack. And believe it or not, after just a few natural moves, white ends up in a completely lost position. They simply have no effective defense against your simple but crushing kingside attack. In the game we are analyzing, white tried knight to h2, preparing for your push. But you go ahead with pawn to g4 anyway, opening the kingside. After the exchanges, your rook joins the attack, and white defends with knight to f1. Even though there is no immediate checkmate, you castle queenside and keep building pressure. White played pawn to f3, but that only gave black a tactical chance. The move pawn to g3 is a brilliant sacrifice. When white captures, you follow with rook takes h2, removing a defender. If the queen recaptures, then queen to h4 check drives the king into the open. Black ends up with 2 minor pieces for a rook and keeps the initiative. From there, you bring your bishop to g5, double your rooks on the h-file, and jump your knight to h4 or f4. The result is overwhelming. White has no real defense, and black's attack is decisive. That example shows very clearly the typical attacking plan for black. No matter what move order white chooses, your kingside attack will always be the central idea. Still, there are some opponents who will try to oppose it. Instead of the modest pawn to d3, some of them will go for pawn to d4, which is the standard plan in the Ruy Lopez. By doing this, white is trying to challenge you in the center and distract you from your kingside assault. But this overlooks an important detail. You already placed your queen on f6, and from there it indirectly controls the d4 square. So when white plays pawn to d4, you are fully ready to take advantage. First, you play pawn to b5 to push back the bishop, freeing your knight. Once the bishop retreats, you are ready to capture on d4 and remove that central pawn. After the exchanges, you not only win material, but also eliminate one of white's key defenders. If white tries to recover by exchanging queens, that only simplifies into a favorable position for you, because after the trades you are left a pawn up while keeping the initiative. It is also worth pointing out that if white tries bishop to d5 in this position, it simply does not work. You have the calm defensive move knight to e7, which both protects your knight and threatens the bishop. Far from being dangerous, bishop to d5 turns out to be a mistake, since it achieves nothing and only helps your attack. To recap this section, we can see that after your move, pawn to d6, if white castles kingside, it is usually a critical mistake. Technically, it cannot be called wrong in theory, but in practical play it almost always backfires. By castling into your attack, white allows you to play bishop to g4 and start building heavy pressure. With your queen to f6, followed by pushing pawns forward, you create a kingside attack that white is usually completely unprepared to meet. Is there anything else white can try? Sometimes, after pawn to d6, your opponent will be tempted to play pawn to d4, thinking they can use the pin to their advantage. But you can neutralize this idea very easily. Start with pawn to b5, pushing the bishop back to b3. Then you trade on d4, pretending to go for simple exchanges. After pawn takes d4, however, white may stumble into a well-known trap, though many players are still unaware of it. You play pawn to c5, hitting the queen. As it retreats, you follow with pawn to c4, trapping the bishop on b3, which suddenly has nowhere to go. There is one tricky detail to watch for in this line. If white responds with queen to d5, the queen temporarily attacks your rook, which might make it seem like you cannot continue your plan immediately. However, the solution is straightforward. First, play bishop to e6, attacking the queen while also covering the critical a7 square. This move both forces the queen to retreat and secures your back rank. Now, once the queen moves, you are fully prepared to push pawn to c4, trapping the bishop on b3 completely and taking full control of the position. From here, you can relocate your bishop to d7 with tempo. This does two things. It defends your rook and maintains the integrity of your tactical plan. At this point, white is essentially lost, because you are about to win the trapped bishop without giving up any material in return. The combination of precise piece coordination and pawn control leaves white completely defenseless, and your attack is decisive.